If you're a fan of phaser pedals and you're looking for something that bridges the gap between those classic 70s phaser sounds and some all-out crazy modern phaser sounds, then you might just be interested in what we're going to talk about today. In this video, I'm going to be checking out the brand new phaser pedal from the guys at allpedal. This takes you from 70s subtle phasing sounds through to some crazy, almost ring modulator-esque sounds when you really push this thing to the extremes. This is the brand new Microdose Phaser from allpedal. So if you've never heard of allpedal, they're a brand that are based in Kentucky in the US, and all of their pedals are handmade in their workshop right there in Kentucky. So one thing these guys do exceptionally well is they take pedal ideas that are rooted in really classic sounds, like a phaser for example, but then they do their own thing with them. So they've got a bunch of different pedals in their lineup that are based around classic ideas that we all know and love, but they've done the allpedal thing to them, and this is no exception. So what this isn't is a Phase 90 clone. It's a phaser pedal that can do a 70s style phaser, but it can also do a bunch of other crazy stuff too. So in this video, we're going to check out all of the features of this brand new phaser pedal. But before we check out the specs of this thing, just want to let you guys know this is a sponsored video today. The guys at allpedal are paying me to make this video, and they've provided me with the phaser for the purpose of making this video. But as always, all the thoughts and opinions in this video are my own. Okay, so the Microdose Phaser is a very, very tweakable phaser pedal. Now, as you can see just from looking at this thing, there's a lot of options. So let's go through the top of the pedal. So starting over here, we have the warp control. So what this does is this modifies how the waveform that you select behaves. So when this is set to the midnight position like so, the waveform remains unaltered. It just acts as you expect it to. But then when you push this knob either higher or lower, it alters the waveform in a couple of different ways. So allpedal recommend in the manual setting it at midnight to get the feel for the waveform, and then you can use this to kind of warp that waveform as you see fit. Then we have the rate control. The rate control controls the rate or the speed of the phaser effect. So obviously the lower this is, the slower the speeds, and the higher it is, the faster the speeds. This works in conjunction with the multiplier control, and there's also a tap tempo switch. So you've got three different ways there to set your phaser speed. The multiplier switch starts at 0.5. So if you set your speed with this set to 1, that will just be your kind of base level speed. You can then go half speed by going down to 0.5, or you can go 1.5, 2x, 3x, and 4x. That just gives you different increments of the same tempo. Or you can use the tap tempo switch, which will override the rate control. So you can manually tap this as well. Third control then is the depth control. This is kind of just the amplitude of the frequency sweep. So in lower settings, it's more of a subtle phaser, and in higher settings, you get more of an extreme pronounced phaser. Then we have the resonance control. So with the resonance control at its minimum setting, you get what they call the sort of fundamental classic phaser tones. And then as you push this up higher and higher, you get more of an intense, dramatic, really pronounced phaser effect. We have a blend control here. In the 0 position, you get 100% of your clean signal, and up full, it's 100% of the pedal's wet signal. So obviously you can blend in your perfect mix there. And then the level is the output level of the pedal. And here we have the waveform selection. So there are 2 rings to this. There's the inner ring and the outer ring. The inner ring is your standard waveforms. So you've got things like square waves, sine waves, triangle waves, saw waves. There's a ramp, there's a random, and there's a couple of these smoother sort of circle waves. Those are already different sort of flavors of phasing you can get. And then there's an outer ring where the waveforms are a little more extreme and, you know, they sort of mix between different styles of waveforms, so you get these really crazy different sort of phasing effects. You can select between the 2 types with this little toggle switch here, which is standard and alt. Standard is the internal ring, which is the standard waveforms, and then alt is that external one with the crazier ones. And then we have the stages of the phaser. So we've got 2, 4, and 8 stage phaser. So a phaser works by taking the input signal, splitting it into 2, and it applies a series of filters to one of those signals. Then an LFO modulates those filters. So what happens is you've got your kind of your dry signal and then your phased signal. And then what happens is the modulated LFO causes the signals to go in and out of phase with each other, which is where you get that sweeping effect where you get a really pronounced low end, then it gets really thin and it sort of pushes and pulls back. So standard phaser is called a 2-stage phaser because you've got 2 lines of signal. So you get this in and out of phase thing going on. When you go up to a 4-stage phaser, you have 4 lines of phase. So you have multiple filters going in and out of phase. So it's more extreme, more sort of texturally interesting, and there's a lot more going on. And then an 8-stage phaser is the same thing, but it's 8 lines. So you've got your signal with 7 different filters, as it were, being modulated in and out of phase with an LFO. So a 2-stage phaser is more typically a classic sound, and an 8-stage phaser has a lot more going on. It's much more sort of crazy, and you can get some really interesting sounds with that. As far as the quality of the pedal goes, out of the box, it feels great. The switches feel great. The controls feel great. It feels like it's a really well-built piece of gear. But not only do these things function well, but allpedal also put a lot of thought into how they look. So as you can see from the top of this thing, it's got a pretty crazy psychedelic design. But the design isn't just limited to the top. If we look at the side of the pedal, we've got their logo with a little picture there. On the bottom, we have Microdose. And on the side we have phaser. The only side that isn't covered is the top side, which has your in and out jacks and your power supply. There's also an expression pedal jack there on the side as well, so you can control certain parameters with an expression pedal. The design also extends to the underside of the pedal, where you've got this amazing kind of purple sparkle base plate with this really cool design on it. And this is, I'm not sure of the printing type, but it's textural, so you can actually feel the design printed on there. Now, when it comes to putting pedals on pedal boards, that would be a real shame to ruin that by putting Velcro all over it, which is why they give you a plain black base plate with these pedals as well. So anything you have like this that just looks awesome, you can actually swap the base plate for a plain black one and cover that in Velcro and put that on your pedal board without having to ruin this design. I think that the inclusion of a plain base plate is a really nice touch, and that's something that I'd like to see other pedal companies do, because I have many times had to put Velcro on the bottom of pedals that I've not really wanted to put Velcro on, but, you know, it's kind of a necessity to take it on a board, and found that subsequently, you know, I've ruined bottoms of pedals. So something like this is a really nice little thing that they've done, because they don't have to do this. This is an extra expense for them because they're giving you a second base plate, but it's just a really nice thing that you can preserve the way your pedal looks by having this plain one to put Velcro on. So spec-wise, that is about it. So I'm going to plug this thing in now, and we'll hear what it sounds like. Alright, so gear-wise for this video, I'm using my Chapman Guitars ML1X, which is plugged into the Blackstar Studio 10 6L6. The amp is running completely clean with a little bit of reverb, and that is running through the 2 Notes Torpedo Captor X straight into my audio interface. I'm going to be using some overdrive later on in the video as well, which is going to be coming from the Red 7 Alchemy Overdrive, which I've got running in front of the Microdose Phaser. Alright, so we're going to start by looking at the different waveform types. So I'm going to go straight to the start of that control there, where we have this sort of ramp waveform where we go up and then it drops off sharply. Now you notice I've got everything more or less set to midnight there. I'm just going to bring the depth up a little bit to make that waveform a bit more prominent. Next up we have the opposite one. So this is kind of like a sawtooth wave that starts high and then ramps off and then comes in harder. Then we have a square wave. This is more of a sort of choppy effect. Think of that like a tremolo. Next up we have a triangle wave. This is a very classic phaser sound. This one and the next one, which is a sine wave, are the two types of waveforms that we most associate with phasers. And here's the sine wave. Then we have these two sort of circle waves that are like the peak and the trough of a sine wave. One of them goes down and then back to the normal point, which is the first one, and the second one is sort of from the normal line and boost. Then we have a random wave. Now random is obviously harder to use because it's random, kind of just chops and changes between different waveform movements all the way through. Now I'm going to turn the Alt control on and go back to the start there. So I'm just going to play a bit now and go through the 8 external waveforms. These are where it gets a little bit wackier. So some pretty wacky things going on there in that waveform selection. On the outside, I'm going to go back to a triangle wave now in standard mode, and we'll talk about what some of the other controls do. So I'm going to leave the blend control at halfway for now, because that's kind of the classic phaser sound where you get a nice blend between your phased and your regular signal. I'm going to start with the warp control. So when the warp control is in the midnight position, your waveform will behave exactly as it should. So when I play, we'll just get a standard triangle wave. Now as I move this control, it'll start to change the behaviors of that wave. So from 0 position all the way up. So that's quite a subtle control. That is really used just to really fine-tune whatever your phasing sound is going to be. So as I said in the manual, they recommend starting with that at midnight, and then you can tweak it to suit. Now we're going to look at the speed section. So we've got 3 controls here that do this: rate, multiplier, and tap tempo. So I'm going to set my multiplier in the 1x position, which is the second notch. So I'm going to set my rate with the rate knob. So the lower this is, the slower the speed of the effect. And then the higher that goes, you'll see the LED in the middle changing tempo with the color changes to obviously accommodate the speed here. The higher it goes, the faster the rate. Now, I can use the multiplier control to either go to half speed, which is 0.5, or I can go to 1.5, 2, 3, and 4 times my standard speed. So I can slow my phasing down. Or I can go back to 1, and that's just what I've set it as. Then I can speed it up, so I can go 1.5. Well, then I can go to 2, 3, and 4x. Now if I'm using this live, and obviously I don't want to adjust the rate knob on the fly, I can use the tap tempo switch. Now the tap tempo switch actually overrides the position of the rate knob, so if my rate is set quite slow like this, I can tap tempo a faster rate, like so. And then my multiplier control links to this switch, so I could 4x what I've tapped in. Or I could half speed that if I wanted to. Then as soon as I touch the rate knob again, that overrides the tap tempo that I've put in. So you can use one of these two to override the other one depending on your use case. So now we're going to look at the depth control. So the depth control is how much of the frequency response we're hearing, so the amplitude of that response. So in lower settings, we're getting much more of a classic, smoother, subtler phaser sound like so. increase that, the prominence of the frequency response increases. Then we have the resonance control, and that is the feedback level. So again, the lower this is, the more subtle the effect. All pedals say that in the minimum settings, it gives you that fundamental phaser tone with that classic retro sound. And then as we increase it, again, we get more of that phaser effect going on. There's more prominence and resonance to the phaser, and it becomes more extreme. Then we've got the blend control. Now the blend control is really, really useful because it allows you to blend in your signal. So in the 0 position, you're just going to hear the amp. Even though the pedal is on and you can see the phase circuit is working because the LED is pulsating, you're only going to hear my clean amp. When I use the blend control, then I'm blending in the phaser sound. You'll notice when that's on full, the sound gets quite thin because what I've done there is I've taken out all of my clean guitar tone and I'm only having the affected phase sound. So halfway is kind of the sweet spot if you want those classic phaser tones. And then you can blend that into taste. And the level control I've just got matched with my clean signal so that it's at unity gain, but obviously you can use this to hit the front of the amp or other pedals harder if you want. So I mentioned earlier a little bit about how phasers work and how it works with splitting your signal into different stages. So everything you've heard so far has been on a 2-stage phaser, so that's more of your classic phaser sounds. Now if I go to a 4-stage phaser, you'll notice straight away that the sound becomes more intense. That's without me tweaking anything. The sound just instantly goes to that other level because I've added 2 additional stages of phasing on top. Now in a 4-stage phaser mode, obviously we can push the extremes a lot more. So if I was to push the rate up and the depth up and the resonance, we're going to get more of an extreme sound. And then obviously if we go on to like an alternate waveform, for instance, it's going to get pretty wacky. As you can see there, we can get some pretty interesting sounds. So a 4-stage phaser is great if you want to really ramp up the phaser sound, but without it being too extreme. It almost has an auto wah kind of flavor about it, especially if you set it in some of the more subtle settings. You can do that with a sine wave as well. Or for some more extreme sounds, a square wave. And then where we can really go nuts is when we go to the 8-stage phaser, because this happens. Now we're adding an additional 4 lanes of phasing, so we've got some real wacky stuff going on. Now you can use this quite subtly like I'm kind of doing there, but I can go even more subtle. This one can also get pretty nuts if we start boosting things. Now you will notice that things like the depth control and the resonance control become infinitely more responsive in these higher settings. So with the depth and resonance on full on a 2-stage phaser, it sounds like this. But then when we go to 4-stage, and 8, so those controls have a lot more range in those settings. We can, like I said, we can set an 8-stage phaser really, really subtly. We can do that for some really nice clean sounds. Now, in the alternate mode, I'm just going to select a random waveform here. As you can imagine, with an 8-stage phaser, that's going to be pretty wacky. Now, some of those more extreme tones you may or may not use. I personally wouldn't really use anything that extreme, but what I do really like is I do like those more subtle 8-stage phaser sounds with a triangle wave. That to me is almost verging on the start of what could be like a flanger type sound. Now, one thing you can do with this, which is pretty cool, and I don't know if it's designed to do this, but if we just crank the depth, crank the level, the resonance, and crank the rate, and the multiplier, what I can do in the 8-stage phaser mode is I can get a ring modulator type sound. I don't know if that's intentional or if that's just phasing there pushed to its absolute limits, but you can do that as well if you need to. If you want to go absolutely nuts with this thing, you really can. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn on the Red 7 Alchemy Overdrive, because so far all you've heard is clean tones, and I'm just going to play a little bit. I'm going to start on a 2-stage phaser, and there's a little pop sometimes when you move the stages switch, but that's not a big deal. There's a little pop there if you do move it while you're playing, but you probably wouldn't be doing that live anyway, or in any other situation other than what I'm doing right now. So yeah, I'm just going to play a bit with some overdrive. This is the overdriven tone that I'm going to be using. And I'm just going to move a bunch of different controls on the phaser. I'm going to start in the 2-stage phaser, play, move some things so you can hear how this reacts with an overdriven sound. So just by playing and twisting things there, you could hear there was a mix of kind of classic phaser stuff as well as some weird sounds. Now, I wasn't really doing too much with waveforms. I was just kind of going from triangle to sine wave to square wave because, you know, things like, in my opinion, things like random waves, slightly harder to use for what I would use a phaser for. That's a bit too extreme for my needs. I'm more in this kind of ballpark. That for me is a great phaser sound. I love that sound. It's kind of reminiscent of the 70s vintage phaser sound, but with a little bit more kind of interest going on there. This pedal can also do weird and wonderful things, as I said. So I'm just going to play some slightly more wacky things now. So I'm going to get a lot of rate, depth and resonance here going on. And I'm going to go through the outside ring in 8-stage phaser mode. So everything you hear now is probably going to be quite unusable, but it's going to be some of the more wacky things this pedal can do. So as well as tons and tons of tweakable, incredibly usable tones, there's also a few things in there that, as you just heard, you can go absolutely nuts. Now, those things would be great if you just want to add a moment of insanity to a song. You can just throw something like that in just to really kind of turn a few heads. It's really interesting that you can do so much with one pedal. Now, I really like this thing. I am someone who comes from the background of using more vintage voiced phasers, and for me, I still found all of the sounds in there that I wanted to find, and plenty more. So I probably wouldn't use some of the more extreme stuff, but for me, there's some really nice things to be found in the lower depth and resonance settings of a triangle wave 8-stage phaser. There's some really nice sounds here. So I really like that sound. That's a phaser sound I would use a lot. What do you guys think? Let me know down below in the comments what you think of the sounds of the Microdose Phaser. I think this is a great pedal. I really like what allpedal do. They're built like tanks and they've got so many cool sounds in there, from things that we know and love through to things that make us think a little bit. And that's really what I like in a pedal company, is someone that takes those classic ideas and just twists and turns them and does their own thing. So yeah, let me know what you guys think. There's some links down below in the description if you want to check out this thing for yourself. It's a really fun pedal and there's lots of interesting and also quite wacky sounds available. So yeah, please check it out. If you're interested in phasers, this is definitely one that should be high up on your consideration list because it's pretty fun. So yeah, big thanks to allpedal for sponsoring this video. Let me know what you guys think down below in the comments. While you're down there doing that, don't forget to hit the like and the subscribe button, and I'll see you guys very, very soon. Thank you so much for watching.